We've now seen some of the basic definitions for graphs. The idea that there can be a path between two nodes. The graph is connected if every pair of nodes has a path between it. And when it's not connected, we've talked about how it falls apart into connected components, these pieces that are internally connected with no edges between them. And we used all this to analyze a graph that was small enough that we could draw it completely by hand. The young internet in late 1970 when it only had 13 nodes. Now let's see how we'd use this to reason about a graph that's much too big to draw, and how we can use some of these definitions and still talk about the graph and actually learn about it, even though we're not really going to be able to draw pictures of it. There are a bunch of graphs we could do this with, and actually, as we go on, we'll see that we're going to be able to do this with a lot of different graphs. I wanted to start with one that is sort of intuitively compelling. We all have our own kind of sense of it, our own intuitions about it, and that's what I'll call the global friendship network. This is simply a graph where there's a node for each person on Earth, and there's an edge between every pair of people who are friends. And we can define friends however we want here. Let's say, friend means you sort of know them on a first name basis. They know you on a first name basis. If you passed each other on the street, you would, likely get into a conversation. That kind of notion of friend. Okay, so let's ask some questions about this graph. First of all, I should stress that this is not a graph that anyone has written down, right? We think about big networks like Facebook, which has over 1 billion people in it, or the global phone network. These are approximations to the global friendship network, but they're not quite there, maybe for two reasons. One is that not everyone is on these systems, obviously, and the other is that friendship doesn't quite equal talking on the phone. It doesn't quite equal being connected by a friend link on Facebook. So let's think about the real global friendship network, just so we can kind of do this thought experiment. And when we think about it, I should stress, we're going to speculate a little bit. And here it'll be okay to speculate. Let's just kind of use our intuitions and think how these definitions would play out. So as a starting question, is the global friendship network connected? It's a reasonable question to ask. So is it the case that every two people, there's some path of friendships, right? Not are they friends with each other, but is there a path of friendships from one to the other? And if you think about it, it feels like the answer is probably no. For example, if there were simply a single person on the Earth who just had no friends, maybe they just don't like people, maybe, for some reason, maybe they're old and, their friends have died or something. But one way or another, a single person with no friends would make the graph unconnected, right? And that's a way to sort of appreciate how brittle this notion of connectivity is, right? A single node can negate it, someone with no friends. Or if you want a small secluded group, right? This sort of canonical notion of like, a remote village that somehow has no contact with the outside world. That would be a very small component with more than one person, but a separate component. Okay, so if the graph is not connected, then what do its components look like, right? What do we have? So maybe there's some one-node components, these people with no friends, and maybe there's some very small ones like these, if they're remote villages and they haven't been reached by the rest of the world. But what about other components? So how about the component you're in, for example? Well, so for that, let's think about you. And although I said the whole graph was too big to draw, and that's certainly true, we can at least start to draw a sort of cartoon version of the picture around you, right? So there's you. And what does your part of the network look like? What are your friends? Well, so let's just speculate some more. So for example, maybe you have friends from childhood, and they know each other, of course. So there's you and two friends from childhood, and you form this little triangle, right? Maybe, you have a job with coworkers, you have a boss, those people know each other. So you and your coworkers, your boss, you all know each other. And that's sort of a different sort of lobe of your friend neighborhood, right? It's sitting over there. And maybe family members, maybe a sibling, a parent, they're in there too. And of course, they might have interesting relations to other parts of your life, right? So your sibling might, for example, play this interesting role where they know some of your friends from childhood, they know some of your coworkers, they know your parent, presumably. And so that actually, that person's kind of has an interesting shape in the network. Okay, so the component you're in certainly has all of that, but that's still not very big. But let's think about that in the entire network, right? So let's say and let's think about one of your coworkers. Let's pick a coworker who was born in a different country, moved recently and is now working with you, and lives close to you, but grew up very far away in the world. Think about that coworker's parents who still live back in the country where they grew up, right? These are people who don't speak the same language as you, or some, quite far around the world. But you do have this person in common, this friend that you both know. But now think about your coworker's parents' friend, okay? So they have a friend. This too is someone who grew up somewhere around the world, has no languages in common with you, and no longer even has people in common with you, right? And so like you could be traveling around the world somewhere, you could end up sitting next to them on a train, and you'd be sitting next to this person who, is maybe significantly older than you and looks different from you and dresses different from you, has no languages in common. You would really have absolutely no idea that there was anything you had in common with this person, despite the fact that there's actually this path of length 3 between you. And we could expand out in almost any direction like this. And what we're starting to learn is that the connected component that contains you is a really very big component, right? It includes people from all over the world, all different cultures, all different age ranges. It seems to actually contain some very large fraction of the entire world. And so one way is to say this, again, being actually deliberately informal, is that you're part of what we'll call a giant component. And in fact, lots of big complex networks have what's called a giant component, which is a single connected component that contains a large fraction of all of the nodes. Okay, so that's a useful insight about complex networks. And we got it, again, by speculating, but we've been speculating on pretty safe ground. It seems pretty clear that there really is this giant component. And in fact, if you go into a big phone network or into the Facebook graph, you in fact see this giant component. Now here's the question. Could there be two giant components in the graph, right? Could the global friendship network have two giant components? And the answer, if you think about it, seems almost surely to be no. I mean, we think about big societies that separate themselves from the world, governments that have closed their borders to the rest of the world. You say maybe that's a big component, but people still do travel there, and right, someone there might know someone, someone near where you live. And the point really is that a component, it's internally connected, but it has to have no edges out of it. And the thing with two giant components would be a single edge between them would bring them together and would turn them into a single component, right? So again, this notion of component is also sort of brittle in that two big components, one edge would negate that. It would turn them into a single component. It would be like having these sort of two giant clouds of stuff next to each other, and a single spark just brings them together, right? And the whole thing would burst into a single component. And so it seems almost sure that there are not two giant components, and that's in fact true. If you were to check data and not speculate, you would in fact find that you almost never have two giant components. In fact, it's interesting to think about, have there ever been situations where you had two giant components in the world friendship network? And in fact, you could argue that at some point in human history, it's possible that that was true. If we think about, say, 10,000 years ago, there's been an interesting set of books written that tries to interpret cultural history from this very long-range geographic perspective. One example of this is Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, which Cornell University actually had all of the incoming freshmen read in 2001. And at the time, although we weren't really thinking about it that way, we all read this book, and you started to appreciate it was sort of making a statement about networks. It was really asking us to think about the cataclysm that befell the civilizations in the Americas roughly 500 to 1,000 years ago, when people from Europe began arriving in North and South America, and these two cultures began meeting. And one way to interpret what it was saying actually was that the world maybe 10,000 years ago, actually the friendship network had two giant components, one in the Europe-Asia landmass and one in the Americas. And what that meant was that when you have two distinct giant components, culture evolves separately, technology evolves separately, and maybe even worse, diseases evolve separately. And so what happened was when Europeans began meeting people in the Americas for the first time, right, these two giant components began coming together, and it really was almost as though a gigantic amount of potential energy was released. And in particular, the technology, and maybe more importantly, the germs of the Europeans completely overwhelmed the civilizations in the Americas, and with extremely destructive consequences. And so the point here is that when we think about a network like the Global Friendship Network, and we start thinking about the basic graph theoretic definitions we have at our disposal, we can actually begin to understand stuff about its structure that we may not have initially a priori thought of, and that may have been hard to articulate without this kind of language. And we can even begin to interpret events over the course of history in this kind of language, and maybe try to understand better why some of these things have turned out the way that they did.